The most dangerous person in that hospital wasn't carrying a scalpel. He carried a mop. 20 specialists had rotated through room 14 of Whitfield Medical Center's private wing over the course of 6 weeks, each arriving with credentials that could wallpaper a hallway and leaving with theories that dissolved by morning. They tested for everything medicine had a name for. They prescribed adjusted, consulted and puzzled, and still 8-year-old Lily Holt kept dying by degrees, one lab result at a time. Her mother had paid for the best minds money could buy. What she hadn't paid, for what no one had thought to pay for, was the janitor who mopped those floors at 2 in the morning and noticed something no doctor in that building had thought to look for. Daniel Mercer arrived at Whitfield Medical Center every evening at 8:10, parked his 12-year-old Ford in the employees' lot near the loading dock, and changed into his gray uniform in a bathroom that smelled of industrial cleaner and old tile grout. The routine had become so embedded in his muscle memory that he could complete it in near total silence, which was useful because the night shift demanded quiet, in the way a library demanded quiet, not as a request, but as a fact of the environment. He was 39, lean in the way that people who forget to eat regularly become lean with calloused hands, and the kind of steady dark eyes that made people uncomfortable when they accidentally made contact with them. Most people in the private wing made a point of not making that contact. He was the janitor. The floors needed mopping. Those were the only 2 facts that mattered to anyone behind that oak door. The private wing of Whitfield was its own ecosystem, separated from the rest of the hospital by a heavy entrance with keypad access and a receptionist named Carol, who smiled at every physician and looked through every support staff member as though they were made of slightly dirty glass. The rooms behind that door were not hospital rooms, in any meaningful sense. They were suites with recessed lighting and framed prints, and beds that had been designed by someone who understood that rich people don't stop being rich just because they're sick. The medical equipment blended into the decor. The IV poles were matte black. The monitors had been calibrated to emit soft beeps instead of the standard alarm pitch, the kind of adjustment that probably cost more than Daniel made in a month. He had cleaned those rooms for 2 years and 3 months, and in that time, he had learned that wealth didn't make illness more dignified. It just made it quieter. Room 14 had been occupied for 6 weeks by a patient he'd never spoken to, only observed in the way he observed everything quietly from the periphery, while his hands kept moving. Lily Holt was 8 years old, small even for her age, with the kind of pallor that went beyond fair-skinned and into something that suggested the blood had found somewhere else to be. She slept more than she was awake. When she was awake, she had barely enough energy for anything except the small television mounted on the far wall, its volume so low it was barely a murmur. Her hair had been losing thickness. Daniel had noticed this the same way he noticed everything without meaning to and without being able to stop. He swept it from the tile floor each night. He said nothing. It wasn't his place to say anything. He understood his place with the precision of someone who had been reminded of it many times. Her mother was another matter entirely. Catherine Holt arrived every morning at 7:45, always in clothes that cost more than the medical equipment, and always moving at the speed of someone who had never once in her adult life waited for anything. She was the founder and CEO of Holt Pharmaceuticals, a company whose name appeared on the side of buildings in 4 states, and she ran it with the kind of focused intensity that made business journalists describe her in terms usually reserved for natural disasters. She was 51, sharp-featured with silver, threading through dark hair she kept pulled back in a way that suggested function rather than style. She spoke to the doctors the way she probably spoke to her board, clearly, precisely, with an expectation of results built into every syllable. She did not speak to Daniel. The floors just stayed clean on their own as far as she was concerned. The lead physician was Dr. Harrison Webb, and if Catherine Holt was a natural disaster, then Harrison Webb was what nature produced when it wanted to manufacture something that looked trustworthy. He was 62, silver-haired, with deep-set eyes that communicated concern so effectively you almost didn't notice how carefully calibrated that concern was. He had trained at Johns Hopkins, consulted at the Mayo Clinic, and published 17 peer-reviewed papers on pediatric metabolic disorders. He also wore custom-tailored suits under his white coat, which Daniel had always found quietly interesting. He'd known enough doctors in his previous life to know that the ones most invested in looking like doctors were sometimes the least interested in being them. Webb headed the team of 20 specialists with the authority of a man who had earned it and intended to collect interest on it every day. He spoke to Catherine every morning and every evening, voice low and grave with a practiced sorrow, the sorrow of a man who had delivered so much difficult news that the delivery had become a performance he no longer needed to rehearse. What no one in that wing knew, what no one who saw the gray uniform ever thought to ask about, was that Daniel Mercer had spent 11 years as a toxicologist and pharmaceutical researcher before the floor fell out from under him. He had a doctoral degree from the University of Chicago that was currently in a box in his apartment closet underneath a broken bicycle pump and his daughter's old finger paintings. He had worked for a mid-size pharmaceutical firm called Vantage Biosciences, led a research team specializing in metabolic toxicity analysis, and had been by every measurable standard exceptionally good at his job. Then, in 2016, he found something he wasn't supposed to find, a pattern in clinical trial data for a cardiovascular drug that suggested the company had selectively omitted adverse event reports before submitting to the FDA. He had documented it. He had reported it internally. He had then made the mistake of assuming that reporting it internally was the same as something being done about it. What happened instead was a process so efficient and so thoroughly disguised as performance review and organizational restructuring that by the time Daniel understood what was happening, his lab access had been revoked, his name detached from every publication it had previously appeared on, and he had been walked out of the building by a security guard who had once brought him birthday cake. The wrongful termination suit went nowhere. The FDA complaint went nowhere. Vantage Biosciences continued to operate. Daniel found himself 37 years old, unemployed, and solely responsible for his 7-year-old daughter, Claire, after his wife decided that a man with no income and a lawsuit going nowhere was not a future she was willing to share. He didn't blame her exactly. He had learned by then to be economical with his blame. The cleaning job at Whitfield had come through a staffing agency 2 years later, and he had taken it for the same reason he'd taken all the jobs in between. It kept the lights on, and Claire fed, and the after-school program paid for. The first time something registered about Lily Holt, it was the smell. He was cleaning the bathroom attached to room 14 on a Thursday night when he caught something beneath the standard antiseptic overlay, something faintly metallic, with a sweetness underneath it that didn't belong. It was the kind of smell that occupied memory rather than the present moment, and it took him 3 days of involuntary intermittent recall before it clicked into place. Dimethyl sulfoxide, a penetration enhancer, something used in pharmaceutical compounding to increase the absorption rate of active compounds through skin or mucous membrane. By itself, unremarkable. In a hospital room where a child was receiving daily IV supplementation through a protocol that had been adjusted 4 times in 6 weeks without any corresponding improvement in her condition, considerably less unremarkable. He filed it away. He said nothing. He went back to the floor. The second thing he noticed was the supplement protocol itself. He had no reason to be examining it, and he wasn't examining it in any official capacity. He noticed it the way a person notices a word, misspelled on a sign, because his brain had been organized to catch certain kinds of irregularities, and it caught them whether he wanted it to or not. The IV supplement line running into Lily's arm each day was labeled as standard nutritional support, the kind given to pediatric patients with metabolic stress. but the frequency had been quietly increased twice in the past 3 weeks, and both increases had coincided within 48 hours both times, with a noticeable deterioration in Lily's neurological responses. The nurses noted the deterioration in their charts. Nobody noted the coincidence. Dr. Webb adjusted the treatment protocol each time and attributed the worsening to disease progression. 20 specialists nodded, because Webb had 17 published papers, and they had been brought in to consult on a difficult case, not to second-guess the lead physician. Daniel noticed. He did not nod. He started paying attention to Webb in a different way after that. Not obviously, he was too experienced at being invisible to do anything, obviously, but with the specific calibrated attention of someone who had spent years looking for things other people missed. What he observed was a man very good at performing concern. Webb spent an appropriate amount of time with Lily each morning. He explained things to Catherine in careful language that was technically informative, while being practically opaque. He consulted with the specialist team in sessions that looked collaborative, but operated like endorsements. Webb presented, specialists discussed, and the plan Webb arrived with was invariably the plan that got implemented. He was also, Daniel noticed, exceptionally attentive to the IV setup, more attentive than a lead physician typically needed to be with a routine supplementation line. He would occasionally wave the nurses out of the room during morning rounds, citing a need for quiet during neurological assessment. He was never in the room long, maybe 4 minutes, maybe 5. But the timing correlated with every subsequent deterioration event, and Daniel had learned a long time ago to trust correlations. He ran the pharmacology through his mind, the way he used to run problems in the lab systematically, without assumption, following the chemistry rather than the clinical narrative. A compound capable of causing this specific constellation of symptoms, deliverable through an IV supplementation line, undetectable on a standard toxicology panel if the dosing was maintained at sub-threshold levels. Several candidates fit partial profiles. One fit the complete picture with a precision that made his chest go tight in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour or the cold kitchen or the untouched coffee going cold beside his elbow. He sat with it for a long time that night. Then he looked at his daughter's bedroom door, slightly ajar the way it always was, because Claire didn't like complete darkness, and he thought about what it would cost him to say something and what it would cost an 8-year-old girl if he didn't. He approached the charge nurse, a competent woman named Deborah, and kept his words careful, explaining that he had a background in toxicology and had concerns about the symptom pattern in room 14. Deborah listened with the expression of a person trying to be kind while processing something deeply unexpected. She told him she'd mention it to the medical team and that he could bring workplace concerns to his supervisor. It was the conversational equivalent of a polite door close. He thanked her and went back to work. He had expected this. It didn't make it easier, but he had expected it. He tried Dr. Patricia Nolan next, a consulting neurologist from Cornell, who seemed to operate outside Webb's gravitational pull more than the others. He caught her alone in the corridor and introduced himself with the directness he understood was a risk. He gave her his name, his previous position, and in 2 precise sentences, his hypothesis and the evidence supporting it. Her expression moved through surprise, then a flicker of genuine consideration, then a visible recalibration as she located his uniform in the hierarchy of the situation. She told him she would review the protocol. He watched her walk away and understood from the particular set of her shoulders that she wouldn't. He was called into the facilities manager's office the following afternoon. The facilities manager, a compact, perpetually tired man named Gerald, told him without rancor that a complaint had been filed regarding inappropriate patient-related conduct, and that any further contact with medical staff about patient matters would result in termination. He nodded. Gerald looked at his desk. Neither of them said anything about whether Daniel was right. Lily Holt had a seizure on a Wednesday night. Daniel was cleaning the corridor outside room 12 when the alarms went off, and the team converged on room 14 with controlled urgency. He stood still with his mop and watched through the open doorway, and what he saw in those few minutes arranged itself in his mind with a clarity that left no room for further deliberation. The seizure was consistent with an acute neurotoxic event. It was also the fourth Wednesday in a row that Lily's condition had deteriorated, one of the 2 weekly slots during which Webb conducted his solo morning assessments. He was done treating this as coincidence. The evidence gathering took 3 nights. On the first, he used a sterile surface swab from the supply room to collect trace residue from the IV line connector during the brief window when the room was unoccupied between nursing shifts. He had no laboratory equipment. He had a basic chemistry kit purchased the following morning from a scientific supply company paid for, with money he hadn't planned to spend, and a kitchen table, and 11 years of knowing precisely what he was looking for. The preliminary test was rudimentary by professional standards. The result was not. The colorimetric reaction was positive for a compound in the synthetic glucocorticoid class, specifically a modified form with a hepatotoxic metabolite profile that wouldn't appear on a standard pediatric tox screen and would, at the dosing level he estimated from the symptom progression, produce exactly the pattern of multi-organ deterioration Lily had been presenting. It was sophisticated. It required pharmaceutical expertise to formulate, and it was being introduced through a medical line that only Harrison Webb touched without a nurse present. On the second night, he documented everything the timeline of Webb's solo assessments cross-referenced against Lily's deterioration events, the irregularities in the supplement protocol, the chemical test results photographed against white paper with his phone, and a written analysis formatted with the precision that left nothing to interpretation. The writing came back to him like an old language. His hand steadied as he worked. On the third night, he pulled Webb's access records for room 14 through the facility's management system, something he had legitimate access to for scheduling purposes, and confirmed the pattern in plain numbers. 41 solo accesses. 41. He also spent 40 minutes looking up Harrison Webb thoroughly, the way you look up someone you need to understand completely. Buried beneath the publications and conference appearances was a business disclosure filed 8 months earlier, a minority stake in a company called Meridian Capital Partners, one of 3 investment vehicles holding short positions in Holt Pharmaceuticals stock. If Catherine's company collapsed, if she were forced to sell in a distressed state, consumed by a dying child, and a medical mystery with no resolution, Meridian Capital Partners stood to collect approximately $90 million. Harrison Webb stood to collect on a portion of that. He stared at that number for a long time. Then he printed everything, organized it into a folder, and put on his uniform. The following morning, Daniel arrived at Whitfield 4 hours before his shift. He had called 2 favors, one to a former colleague who now worked in forensic toxicology at the Illinois State Lab, and one to an FBI field agent named Roy Sellers, who had contacted him 3 years earlier during the Vantage Biosciences complaint, and who had always said, with what seemed like genuine regret, that the case hadn't reached evidentiary threshold. Daniel had sent Sellers a summary the night before with the words, "Different case, same skill set," in the subject line. Sellers called back within 2 hours. He had also, in a move he understood was either very smart or potentially catastrophic, slipped a handwritten note under Catherine Holt's private waiting room door at 6:45 that morning before her daily arrival. It read, "Room 14, supplement line. Ask why Dr. Webb conducts solo assessments. I have evidence. D. Mercer Environmental Services, Ph.D. Toxicology, University of Chicago." Catherine arrived at 7:42. He was in the service corridor adjacent to the waiting room when he heard her heels on the floor, and the next 12 minutes were the most compressed of his recent memory. She found the note. She read it twice. Then she came to find him, because his name and credentials were on it, and Catherine Holt had not built a pharmaceutical empire by being careless with information. She found him in the service corridor. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, with complete, unmediated focus. "Talk," she said. It was not a request. He talked. He showed her the documentation, the timeline, the chemical analysis, the access logs, the financial disclosure. She went through it with the attention of someone who had reviewed thousands of pages of technical and financial material over a career built on exactly those skills. She did not interrupt. She did not look skeptical. She looked for the first time in 6 weeks of observing her, like someone who had stopped performing composure and was simply without protection, afraid. "How long?" she asked. He gave her his best estimate based on the symptom progression. 7 to 8 weeks. She closed the folder. Her jaw tightened in a way that communicated everything a sentence would have taken too long to say. The next 30 minutes moved fast. Catherine contacted her personal attorney and a private security firm simultaneously. Sellers arrived at 8:47 with a colleague. Webb was already in the building. He had logged access at 8:15, and his solo morning assessment of room 14 was scheduled between 9 and 9:30. They had approximately 10 minutes. Webb was intercepted in the hallway outside the attending physician's lounge. He saw the FBI credentials and the folder in Daniel's hands, and his face did something complicated, a rapid micro-collapse of the performance, like a building settling before it falls. He recovered it quickly. He said with the authority of someone who had spent 40 years being deferred to that, this was preposterous. He said that a janitor's amateur chemistry was not evidence of anything. He said Daniel's name with a specific inflection, designed to remind everyone present of the hierarchy they were standing in. Then, Catherine Holt, who had been standing slightly to Webb's left, and whom he had not fully registered until that moment, placed the open folder in front of him and said in a voice that sounded like it came from somewhere very cold, "I'd like you to explain the Meridian Capital Partners disclosure, Harrison." Webb looked at the folder. He looked at Sellers. He found nothing useful in Catherine's expression and said nothing further without an attorney present. He was escorted from the building 12 minutes later. The FBI forensic team arrived that afternoon. The IV supplement compound was seized and fast-tracked for analysis. Results confirmed a modified synthetic corticosteroid compound with a custom hepatotoxic metabolite profile present at levels that explained the entire 6-week clinical picture with grim precision. Lily's treatment was immediately redirected under a new clinical team. Within 72 hours of the toxic compound being removed from her protocol, her neurological indicators began to improve. Within 2 weeks, she was sitting up in bed, arguing about whether the hospital's vegetable soup constituted actual food, which the nursing staff took as an encouraging sign. Harrison Webb was arrested 8 days later. The charges included attempted murder, medical fraud, and securities fraud in connection with the Meridian Capital Partners position. His attorney issued a statement describing the charges as baseless, then was replaced within a week by a different attorney, which most observers interpreted as a comment on the direction the evidence was heading. The case was built in substantial part on the documentation Daniel had assembled at a kitchen table between midnight and 2 in the morning over 3 nights, and on the toxicological analysis he had performed with equipment that cost less than Webb's annual dry cleaning bill. The FBI agent who submitted the evidentiary summary to the U.S. Attorney's Office noted in the cover memo that the initial identification of the compound had been made by a private individual with a doctoral background in toxicology who had been working as a hospital janitor. In a different context, that might have been an interesting footnote. In context, it was simply what had happened. The hospital administration issued a statement expressing full cooperation with the investigation and outlining a review of oversight protocols. There were meetings about accountability that Daniel was not invited to. A formal commendation arrived in the mail in an envelope addressed to environmental services staff, as though there had been some uncertainty about whether he still worked there, which there had been for about a week, while the facilities manager worked through the question of whether the person who had just helped the FBI solve an attempted murder was an asset or a liability. He ultimately concluded with visible relief that the answer depended on how the story got told. Catherine Holt did not wait for the hospital to act. The week after Lily began to stabilize, she requested a meeting with Daniel at a hotel downtown, where she held her board meetings, neutral territory. She had said which he appreciated. He showed up in the clothes he wore to Claire's school events, which were not his hospital clothes, but were also not a suit. And Catherine, who arrived in a suit that probably cost more than his car, did not appear to notice or care. She sat across from him in a private dining room and said without preamble, "I owe you my daughter's life. Tell me what you need." Daniel had thought about this. He told her he needed 3 things. He needed a reference letter that accurately described his background and what he had done addressed to any future employer. He needed his name reattached to the research he had contributed to during his time at Vantage Biosciences. There was a legal path to that, and he needed someone with resources to help him walk it. And he needed enough income stability in the short term to not have to choose between fighting for the above and keeping his daughter in a school that was working for her. Catherine listened to all 3, made notes in a precise hand, and confirmed she could address each of them. She also mentioned that Holt Pharmaceuticals had been trying to fill a director-level position in its toxicology division for 7 months without finding anyone they considered adequate, and that she would like him to interview for it when he was ready, with the understanding that ready meant when he was ready, and not when it was convenient for her. He told her he appreciated that distinction. They shook hands, and it was the kind of handshake where both people meant the same thing by it. He told Claire about it over dinner that weekend, most of it in the version appropriate for a 9-year-old who was old enough to understand that her father had done something important, but young enough that the full architecture of the thing didn't need to be conveyed all at once. She listened with the stillness she always had when concentrating hard, chin in one hand, fork suspended above her pasta. "So, you figured it out because you used to be a scientist?" she asked. He said yes, essentially. "But they didn't know you were a scientist," she said. He confirmed this. She turned it over for a moment. "That seems like their problem," she said, and went back to her pasta. He looked at her for a second longer than was probably necessary. Then he agreed that it was. He visited Lily Holt once, about 3 weeks after the arrest, on an afternoon when Lily was alert in a way she hadn't been for months. Catherine was there standing near the window with the look of someone who had recently been reminded of how much was breakable in her life and was paying attention to that in a new way. Lily was drawing in a sketch pad and looked up when Daniel came in with the frank, uncomplicated assessment that children deliver without ceremony. "Are you the janitor?" she asked. He said he was. She seemed to find this satisfactory. "My mom said you figured out what was wrong with me." He told her he'd had help from the chemistry. She considered this. "I like chemistry," she said. "We did experiments in school." He told her that was a very good thing to like. She returned to her drawing, apparently satisfied, and he stood in that room for a moment, the room he had cleaned for 6 weeks, while carrying something no one had thought to ask him about, and felt the specific, uncomplicated satisfaction of a problem resolved completely. The research position at Holt Pharmaceuticals took 6 months to materialize, during which time Daniel finished his notice at Whitfield and completed consulting work on 2 cold cases that the FBI forensic unit forwarded through Agent Sellers, who had developed a habit of sending him interesting problems that Daniel did not object to. In October, he took Claire out of the city for a long weekend, the first time they'd done something like that in 2 years, and drove north with no particular destination until they found a cabin rental with a decent view and a fireplace that worked. They spent 3 days doing nothing that required expertise of any kind. It was Claire informed him on the drive home with the authority of a 9-year-old who had formed a definitive opinion the best weekend she could remember. He told her there would be more of them. He meant it. He started at Holt Pharmaceuticals on a Monday in November. His office was smaller than the one he'd had at Vantage Biosciences, but had a better view, and the work was more rigorous, less encumbered by the institutional pressures. He now understood had been shaping the science at his previous employer, in ways he'd been too professionally optimistic to recognize at the time. His new colleagues were curious about him in the careful, respectful way people are curious about someone whose story they know secondhand and whose presence requires them to revise certain assumptions. He didn't explain himself at length. He did the work the way he had always done the work and let the work explain him. He kept the gray uniform in a bag in his closet at home, not as a souvenir and not out of sentiment. He kept it because it was a fact about him, not a past fact, filed and completed, but a present one, something that had shaped how he moved through problems and what he noticed and why. The years he had spent invisible had not been wasted years. They had been an education of a different kind, in observation, in patience, in the discipline of carrying knowledge without any immediate place to put it. He had cleaned the floors of a hospital where 20 of the best minds available had missed something that cost an 8-year-old girl 6 weeks of her life and nearly cost her everything, and he had moved through that building unseen, carrying what he knew, waiting for the moment when being unseen was the exact advantage the situation required. He had looked. He had kept looking, and when the thing that mattered came into focus, he had been ready because he had spent years training himself to find precisely what the room wasn't meant to show him. Some people spend their whole lives being seen and never learn to observe. Daniel Mercer had learned it the hard way in gray on a night shift 1 floor at a time, and in the end, it had been enough.